Good Erev Shabbos. Hope everything is well. When I was studying in yeshiva in Israel, after I graduated from high school, the eating situation we had in yeshiva was, let's put it this way, far from luxurious. We did receive 3 meals a day, which was good, but the food was at best ever mediocre and occasionally, even often, inedible. Now, somehow, my peers and I all found a way to keep ourselves from being too hungry by purchasing extra food from the local market that was in the neighborhood, by receiving packages from our family in America and in Israel, and by ordering food from pizza stores and other small other restaurants in a nearby city. Now, when I first arrived at yeshiva, I viewed this lack of food, um, the lack of food relative to what I had become accustomed to in America, as being a fault in the institution, in the yeshiva. Um, as far as I could see, there was no philosophical or educational reason that the school couldn't provide sufficient, enjoyable food for us, enough food for us and food that we like. Um, the only reason why there wasn't enough food and the food wasn't good was because of inattention to the needs of the students by the administration, and because of insufficient financial resources that the yeshiva had to pay for better food and for people to make higher quality food. After years of going to American schools and shuls that bribed me to study Torah by offering huge buffets of buffalo wings and chicken poppers before, during, and after the learning programs that they offered, I was under the impression that Torah and good food went hand in hand. And so the only reason the yeshiva didn't provide that was because there's something wrong with the yeshiva. But a few months into my studies in yeshiva in January of that year, one of my high school teachers visited the yeshiva where I was one of 27 graduates of my alma mater that were studying there. So during a meeting with me, this teacher, who's also a rabbi, I called him Rebbe, he called into question my plan to matriculate at a secular university in the in the next fall of that year. I had argued to him that I could study Torah on any campus, and that I would be able to become as scholarly as I wanted, even if I didn't attend Yeshiva University, where Torah study was built into the curriculum. And the rabbi, this teacher of mine, responded by saying that becoming a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar, requires sacrifice, requires suffering, requires being willing to go through the fire, he said. And he asked me, do you think that going to this university and learning when you can is enough to be considered going through the fire? And the rabbi's question to me shook me. While I wanted to convince myself that he was wrong, that following my plan would not prevent me from studying Torah at a high level, from achieving whatever I wanted to in Torah study, I was deeply disturbed by the notion of going through the fire for Torah. In what ways was I really making any sacrifice for my learning? Obviously, to study Torah at a high level, to achieve expertise necessary to be a Talmid Chacham, you have to be willing to devote significant time and effort. You have to be willing to miss many hours of sleep while learning Torah. That was clear. But I had not until then thought it necessary to actively sacrifice comfort and opportunity, even when not strictly necessary, for the sake of Torah. The Mishnah in the final chapter of Pirkei Avot seems to support the view of my high school teacher, because there Chazal write, "Kachi darka Torah." This is the way of Torah. Pat b'melach tochal mayim msura tishta v'al haaretz tishan v'chayitzar tichya uvatorah ta'amel. Such is the way of Torah, that you will eat bread with salt, drink rationed water, sleep on the ground, and your life will be one of pain, and the Torah you shall labor over. Mishnah implies that growth in Torah study requires subjecting oneself to the bare minimum, to eating just bread with salt, to sleeping on the floor, to experiencing pain. And the Rambam, based on a Gemara in Brachot, says something very similar and takes it even further. He writes, the words of the Torah do not remain permanently with one who is lazy in acquiring them, nor with such who study the Torah in an environment of luxury and amidst eating and drinking. But how do you maintain your Torah permanently? One who kills himself for them, for the words of Torah, and who constantly causes pain to his body, and who does not yield sleep to his eyes, nor dozing to his eyelids. I witnessed firsthand several of my peers attempt to live following this advice. They brought their thin mattresses to the Beit Midrash building, to the main study hall, to that building, and they slept in a classroom downstairs. They showered irregularly, they ate significantly less than they had previously, and they generally molded their physical and mental health to match the culture of sacrifice for Torah in the yeshiva world. And it took, for me, until after Pesach to join into this pattern, but I eventually started eating all of my meals while learning Torah in the Beit Midrash, spending as many as 16 consecutive hours a day in the Beit Midrash for several weeks at a time. Now, in the years since leaving yeshiva, I will admit that I've not been able to maintain that kind of intensity and personal sacrifice. Not even close. Nothing close to it. But the question for me is whether it was ever necessary in the first place, and whether there is an ideal in trying to get back to that. Is physical self-denial something that is valued by Judaism and a sine qua non for becoming a Torah scholar? Do you need to do that in order to become a Talmid Chacham? Do we have to eat less, sleep in uncomfortable places, cause ourselves discomfort or even pain? Is such self-denial, the experience of going through fire, an ideal for the observant Jew? Does it represent true piety to suffer even when it's not strictly necessary for the purposes of Torah study? There is a pasuk that we're going to read in the Torah tomorrow morning that seems to confirm this notion of physical self-denial as being a requirement for Torah greatness. Moshe warns the Jewish people that while they were in the wilderness, while God provided them with food, shelter, and clothing, such that they did not need to work, they did not need to really do anything, they got these things. They also, although they had those things provided to them, they also did not have any excesses or luxuries. But Moshe told them that when they will enter the promised land, things are going to be different. They're going to grow crops from the ground, and it's going to be hard work, but they're going to achieve wealth and success and comfort. And they may come to eat and be satisfied and build nice homes to live in and amass cattle, sheep, gold, and silver. And all that comfort and all that luxury, says Moshe, may lead Israel to forget Hashem and what he did for them during the exodus from Egypt and its aftermath, which would ultimately lead to sin and to disaster. And a few psukim later, Moshe reminds the people of their failure during the sin of the golden calf, which they committed while Moshe was on top of Mount Sinai receiving the tablets of stone from God, the Luchot HaBrit, a time during which Moshe says about himself, I stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. I did not eat any bread nor drink any water. And the verse implies, this pasuk implies that Moshe, by on Mount Sinai not eating and drinking, he reached an ideal state while receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai. He was able to live without food or water for 40 straight days. Chatam Sofer explains that Moshe was able to sustain himself on the spiritual experience of Sinai alone, and he did not need to eat or drink. In other words, there's a religious value in denying oneself food and drink, in minimizing physical satisfaction, particularly in the context of food, as much as possible. That satisfaction should derive from closeness to God alone, from just spirituality. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov learns the same lesson from a Talmudic comment about another verse in our Parshat. Moshe tells the Jewish people that when they enter the promised land, they're going to lack nothing and relatively effortlessly grow produce. And he continues, and you're going to eat, and you're going to be satisfied, and you're going to bless Hashem, your God, for the good land which he has given you. And the Gemara in Brachot points out the simple understanding of this verse is that there's only one requirement, one situation in which you're going to say Birkat Hamazon, recite a blessing of thanksgiving to God for the food that you eat. And that is that you have to be satisfied. You have to be full from the meal. And the Gemara says that God shows favor toward the Jewish people, even though they often make mistakes. The Jewish people makes mistakes. God forgives and shows his favor, unfairly pardons us from any punishment that we might receive, because the Jewish people say Birkat Hamazon for much less than would make us full, for eating as little as a kazayit or a kabitz of the volume of an olive or an egg. And Rabbi Nachman explains that this Gemara implies that not only do the Jewish people recite Birkat Hamazon for less than Kedei Sofa, for less than the amount that satisfies us, that makes us full, but we say Birkat Hamazon on that smaller amount because we have adopted the ideal of eating only a kazayit or a kabitza, eating only a very small amount of food. In other words, the Jewish people overcome the temptation to eat to satisfaction, and we limit ourselves to eating just morsels of food to defeat the vice of physical desire. Rav Shlomo Yosef Zevin records a story about Rav Shalom Yosef of Sadigora, who observed this piety of physical self-denial. He didn't eat much. And one day when his daughter saw that he wasn't eating the food that he was served for maybe lunch, and she saw how thin he was and he wasn't eating, she began to cry out of a fear for her father's well-being. And Rav Shlomo Yosef responded by displaying his physical strength, lifting and holding up a chair with only 2 fingers. And he told her that if a man provides his soul with all its needs, then he can be strong even without eating. All you need to do is learn Torah, and then you can still be strong. However, as usual, there's another perspective on this topic. Rabbi Yehuda Amital, the late Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, quoted a story about Rav Meir Shapiro, the founder of the Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin in the early 20th century in Poland. The yeshiva, when Rav Shapiro opened it in 1930, shortly before the Holocaust, that yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, was unique among all the Torah institutions of Eastern Europe, because it had a huge library, comfortable dormitories, a dining hall, electricity, indoor plumbing, almost all of which were unheard of in the yeshiva world. And Rav Meir Shapiro, of course, was questioned for why he was providing such modern luxuries to his students. After all, the Mishnah says, as we read earlier, that it's the way of the Torah to eat nothing but bread and salt, to sleep on the ground, to suffer for Torah. And Rav Shapiro answered that we're misunderstanding the saying, this Mishnah, to be normative rather than descriptive. It's not normative. You don't have to eat nothing but bread and salt all the time. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot is simply lamenting the reality that in order to study Torah, sometimes that requires sacrifice of our physical well-being. That sometimes we are required to suffer such discomforts as less food and less water and sleeping on the floor, if necessary, in order to study Torah. But the ideal environment for Torah study, said Rav Shapiro, is one in which the distractions of suffering are alleviated, in which the students of Torah are able to focus on what they're doing. Rabbi Yaakov Shimshon of Kosovo once led such an exciting study session of stories and Torah for his Hasidim that his students forgot after Shacharis to eat breakfast. And one of the Hasidim identified their experience with that of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe said that he was able to forego bread and water for 40 days while studying Torah on Mount Sinai. And he said, you see, we could do it too. But Rav Yaakov Shimshon rejected this reading. And he explained that when Moshe says in the Torah that he did not eat bread or drink water for 40 days on Mount Sinai, on Har Sinai, Moshe was not saying that he did something that was ideal. He was stating his regrets for not redeeming bread and water by using them to serve Hashem during that time. Moshe was thinking of all the divine sparks that he left behind that he did not collect from that bread and water. And perhaps that is the meaning of the verse, and you shall eat and be satisfied and bless Hashem your God. That Moshe is trying to explain to the Jewish people that eating and drinking are not intrinsically problematic activities, nor is the desire to eat something that must be always overcome. However, it is important that we direct our eating toward holy purpose, toward sustaining us for service to the Ribbon Shalom, the Master of the universe, that we redeem the sparks found in our luxuries and give them meaning. And this principle is not limited to food, of course. Whether we're enjoying a new home, a trip to a fun destination, a day of beautiful weather, a gripping novel, or a funny movie, there are different ways to approach these luxuries. We can forget the fact, on one hand, that these things are ultimately gifts from God and we can attribute them to our own success. We can fall into the trap of enjoying pleasures for their own sake and not infuse them with any meaning. We can force ourselves into the difficult position of having to choose between eating to satisfaction, which would lead to sin, and abandoning all comforts and refinements for the sake of Torah, abandoning anything that we might enjoy altogether. On the other hand, there's a middle way. We can recognize that these pleasures can be directed for holy purpose. We need not deny ourselves all worldly pleasure, eating nothing but bread and salt and limited water. In the area of learning, of Torah study, we need not abandon plans to attend universities or classes that challenge us intellectually. We do not have to gratuitously deny enjoyment of the best that has been taught and said, as Matthew Arnold put it. But we do have to make sure that our learning is dedicated toward and put in the context of growing as Jews, as people who are observant of the Torah and committed to its values. I want to wish you a safe and enjoyable Shabbos.